Sure, which will guide us in this introduction to tax justice for education. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hector, and it's a real privilege to be with you all, and just so excited at the way in which the Global Student Forum has come together in the last couple of years. Such an important thing to have, a sort of global expression of student union voices. And I think this is a great opening issue to talk about the links between tax justice and education justice. They are absolutely intimately connected. And we hope that over the session today and then the sessions next week and after, you'll understand what some of those connections are, why they're so important, and what can we do about it to transform the financing of education in the coming years. And I think one of the important starting places is to look at this in the context of a decolonization narrative, decolonizing the way in which education finance is talked about. Because if you look at all of the global meetings on education up until last year, all of the global meetings over the last 30 years, every time the international community comes together, it ends up talking about aid, or it talks about how can we increase the aid and harmonization of aid for education, or how can we increase concessional loans for education. And it spends a huge amount of time talking about that. And, you know, there is a real problem that many countries, in low income and lower middle income countries in particular, as a result of the global efforts to harmonize aid and to work together, you often find that national education policies are shaped more by a dialogue between all of the external donors and the Ministry of Education, rather than through national legislation, parliamentary debate. Rather than sort of legislation, you end up with education reform being shaped by donor-funded projects. And that is deeply problematic when we look at it from a decolonization perspective. And equally, particularly disturbing is the fact that if you look globally, 97% of the finance for education comes from domestic sources. In fact, aid and loans, if you add up all of the bilateral aid, all of the multilateral aid, all of the concessional loans linked to education, it adds up to about 3% of the financing available for education in the world. 97% comes from domestic sources, and fundamentally, it comes through tax resources. But this 3% that does come from aid and loans has led to a real distortion in the power and the decision-making over the direction of educational reform in many countries. And it's not just the aid architecture that is a problem, it's also the wider global financial architecture, where you still have most ministries of finance around the world looking over their shoulders all the time at the International Monetary Fund and the policy advice given by the International Monetary Fund about what it means to have a sound economy. And the default advice of the International Monetary Fund in dealing with national governments around the world, global south and global north, is an agenda that is based on cutting public spending, imposing austerity, and in particular, cutting the public sector workforce that profoundly affects education. And so it's a result, I think, of 40 years of a neoliberal worldview, which is premised on cutting public spending, plus the rising power of donors who end up projectizing what education reform should be about, has led to a deep, deep crisis in education around the world. And you end up with all sorts of problematic and forced solutions, such as the introduction of tuition fees in higher education, which really in the past had never really been considered. It was always considered that education is a right and that people should be given active incentives and grants to go to university, because actually increasing the education of your population is generally a public good, good for the society, good for the economy. But to end up in a situation where tuition fees are charged, this is as a result of this chronic underfunding and the mindset that has taken hold in recent years. It is also responsible at another level. You know, the World Bank for many years argued that national governments couldn't fund their education systems and therefore needed to introduce user fees even in primary education. And it took a very concerted campaigns to push against those private user fees in primary education and to run campaigns for the abolition of those user fees. But the mindset of the World Bank is that children should pay to go to school. And we found, in fact, back in 2000, at the height of the World Bank's influence, 90 countries charged children to go to primary school. This is not the way in which you finance a public education system. This is actually the most regressive way of financing a system, because you're passing the costs of education onto parents, and the poorest parents will not be able to pay, and you end up with mass exclusion. In fact, when we had national campaigns for the abolition of user fees in East Africa in particular, and national campaigns that were victorious in shifting government policy, in the case of Kenya, 2 million children went to school for the first time the following year because it was the first time they could afford to go to school. Likewise, in Tanzania, in Burundi, in Malawi, in Ghana, national campaigns for the abolition of fees were fundamental to expanding access. But it's not just this
défense de l'éducation a été critique. Donc, ce n'est pas seulement une question.
Não é esse o problema. O fato é que temos uma escassez de profesores.
Se necesitan 69 millones de profesores, de docentes en los años venideros, y queremos asegurar que cada niño de todos los grupos etarios tengan acceso, o cada niño tenga acceso a educación primaria, secundaria y terciaria, o de superior. Entonces, como resultado
of education, forces that are accelerating the privatization of education, including some of the nightmare scenarios of introduction of low-fee private schools, such as the work of the Bridge International Academies, now known as New Globe schools, who had as their objective, when they launched in the US, an objective of making $500 million profit over the next 10 years by providing education to children living in poverty in Africa, which in itself strikes me as just fundamentally unethical and was deeply problematic in terms of the lies, the myths, the misrepresentations that they used in order to expand their network of low-fee private schools. Fortunately, we've had lots of popular campaigns and actions to limit their spread, but there is still a threat from privatization when you have chronic underfunding of public education systems. And the truth is, particularly, you know, you have a very large number of children now living, particularly working in classrooms in rural communities with perhaps over 100 children in a room with an undertrained and under-equipped teacher. And it's very difficult for anybody to learn. So you have a crisis in learning as a result of the chronic underfunding of the public system. So this is the consequence of the failure of the international community to properly come to terms with how do you finance public education systems. And the simple truth is that public education systems need to be financed through fair and progressive tax. This is something that we finally, after many years, managed to get onto the global education agenda last year in what was called the Transforming Education Summit that took place at the UN General Assembly in September of last year. And it was the first time ever that heads of state have actually met to talk about education. Normally, whenever there's international meetings on education, it's just ministers of education. This was heads of state. And the call to action on education finance that came out from that provides a much more compelling agenda of change. And our challenge now is to make sure that that's followed through and that we hold heads of state and ministers of finance to account for the radical agenda that was agreed at that summit. Now, the core of the demands that came from that summit, the call to action, is that we need to focus attention on the domestic resource mobilization, because that's where the funding for education is really going to be generated in a sustained and sustainable way. And most important, whenever the international community does talk about domestic financing, it tends to talk about the share of the national budget that's spent on education. There's a lot of attention paid to, well, countries should be spending 20% of their national budget on education. And many countries do spend 20% of their national budget on education, but they still don't have enough to provide quality public education. Countries that fall short of that 20%, absolutely, we should put pressure on them to expand and to spend a fair share of their budget on education. But when you talk about the budget share, you end up in a situation where you're in competition with other public services. You say education should get 20% or 21%, 22%, then the health sector, you end up being played off with the health sector or water or energy or transport. And it's only when we come to terms with the fact that a 20% share of a small pie is a small amount that we can start to shift things. And that the collective interest is to focus on the size of the pie. If the government isn't got enough revenue overall, how are you going to finance quality education and other public services at the same time? And the simple truth is that the single most effective thing that most governments could do to expand spending on education and to expand spending on other public services would be to expand their tax revenues and to do so in a fair way. Now, there's one statistic which is often quoted when we talk about tax revenues, and it's called the tax to GDP ratio. How much tax does a national government collect from? And if you look at most low-income countries, the average tax to GDP ratio is 16%. Middle-income countries often have a tax to GDP ratio on average of about 30%. High-income countries, tax to GDP ratio of 40%. Scandinavian countries who have, often 45% tax to GDP ratio. And it's interesting to note that it's in the countries which have the highest tax to GDP ratio that people are often happiest to pay tax, because they see that in exchange for their tax, they get quality public services. Now, going back to the low-income countries, if you have the tax to GDP ratio of 16%, it's almost impossible to adequately fund quality education and other public services. So there has to be an urgency to expand that. And it is, the research shows that most countries can expand their tax to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points over the coming 5 years. So a low-income country, 16% at the moment, could rise to 21% tax to GDP ratio. I know this is getting a bit complicated, but it's important to then consider the effect of that. If you expand your tax to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points, you can actually double the spending on education in your country. And you can double the spending on health in your country. And you can significantly expand spending on other public services. So it's by taking action to expand tax revenues that you will have the most profound difference in being able to resource your public education system. And let's face it, most education systems don't need just a bit of tinkering, a little bit more money, a little bit here and there. It's a scale of difference that we need to see to really rebuild good quality public systems, to rebuild the public confidence in a public education system. And a doubling of the education budget is what is needed if we're going to achieve that. And it's a doubling of the education budget would enable you to remove tuition fees in higher education, to stop the slide to privatization, to employ the teachers necessary to bring class sizes down, and to improve the quality of every public school in the country. Now, most governments could expand their tax to GDP ratios over this 5-year period, over the next 5 years, and achieve that if they're given the support to do so. And it's clearly important to have a focus on collecting those increased taxes from the wealthiest individuals and the wealthiest companies. At the moment, the wealthiest multinational companies in most countries are not paying tax. Either they attract a tax holiday. They say we're only going to invest in your country if you give us a tax holiday or some form of other tax incentives. And if they do end up making a profit in a country, they find creative ways to aggressively avoid paying tax and export the profit to tax havens. It is the case that in most countries, I mean, it's hard enough to get countries in some of the richest countries to tax the biggest multinationals. Low income, lower middle income countries find it extremely difficult because of the way multinational companies can export their profits. And if you have the richest individuals and the richest companies not paying tax in your country, it's really difficult to finance quality public services. So the focus of tax reforms need to be on those wealthiest companies, but also the wealthiest individuals, and not just on their income, but on their property, on land, on inheritance. There's a whole range of taxes that can be put in place that pass the burden of tax making, not onto people living in poverty, but onto the wealthiest sectors in society. And there are some examples now of governments that are starting to do that, particularly in Latin America, Colombia notably, but also Argentina and Chile, are starting to show a path of how you can build a more progressive tax system that passes the burden onto those who are most able to pay. For some countries, it's actually quite difficult to put in place effective expansion of taxes because of the way the global tax rules are set. At the moment, for the last 60 years, the organization that has been setting the global tax rules is the Club of Rich Nations, the OECD. And it is only last year, in September, at the UN General Assembly, that as a result of coordinated push from ministers of finance in Africa, that there was an agreement, a vote on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly to shift the locus of tax policy making to a representative body at the United Nations. And that gives us a seed of hope for changing the way in which global tax rules are set, which will help countries to put in place more effective progressive tax systems themselves. Now, action on tax is absolutely fundamental if we're going to expand spending on education, but it has to be put in the context, in a wider context, of other forces that are fundamentally undermining the capacity of governments to spend on education. And perhaps most important amongst there are two key things. One is debt. There are a huge number of countries that are now in debt crisis that are spending more on servicing their debts than they are on education. And at this summit, at the UN, the Heads of State Summit, Transforming Education Summit, we made an explicit call for any country that is spending more on debt servicing than on education to be at the front of the queue for debt renegotiation and debt cancellation programs. Because not only does debt mean that you end up not having sufficient revenue to spend, even if you have a large amount of tax that is collected, you have to pay your debt first. Not only is that a problem, but also debt sort of throws you into the hands of the International Monetary Fund. If you are in debt, you end up having to go to the IMF as the lender of last resort. And the IMF end up then imposing a set of very strict conditions that will constrain public spending. So debt empowers the IMF. Although the IMF also has a huge amount of power anyway over ministries of finance. Their policy advice, their political steer to ministries of finance shapes how most ministries of finance perceive education spending. And the one thing that the IMF is particularly obsessed with, in every country where they offer policy advice, they tell governments, oh, you've got to hold down the public sector wage bill. You've got to somehow stop this bloated government bureaucracy. But the public sector wage bill does not pay for bureaucracy. The public sector wage bill pays mostly for teachers, nurses, and doctors. The single biggest group in almost every country paid for by the public sector wage bill are teachers. And if the IMF is coming along and telling you to cut or constrain your spending on the public sector wage bill, you cannot increase spending on education. Now, what we're trying to push at the moment is to challenge the IMF on this obsession with cutting spending and cutting public sector wage bills, because that is the single biggest thing blocking most governments from expanding spending on education. Rather than recommend austerity, which is what the IMF always do, and cuts in public spending, there is a different path that they could recommend. They could recommend governments to expand their tax revenues. That's the fundamental choice that can be made. Expand your tax revenues rather than cut public spending. And at the moment, unfortunately, the IMF every time calls for the cuts in public spending rather than expanding domestic tax revenues. We have to challenge that mindset. We have to challenge this cult of austerity that actually the IMF and most ministries of finance are still caught up in. Have I lost access for a moment?
Apologies, David. There was an interference of a participant who unmuted. We can hear and see you nicely.
Okay. I can't see myself, but that's okay. I don't need to. So I'm almost wrapped up now. I just, it seems to me that we need to use the quite radical call to action from this Transforming Education Summit that heads of state and ministries of finance are aware of and could be held to account to. And the centerpiece of this is to shift our thinking that rather than cut spending and cut the public sector workforce and cut the number of teachers and hold down spending, there is always an alternative. And the fundamental alternative is to expand tax revenues. And if you do take bold action to expand tax revenues, you can double your spending on education and on some other public services. That's the sort of fundamental shift that we need to see. There's an opportunity now, which I think we have not had in the past, to really make that happen. I think the more that we can mobilize the youth and student movements to be part of the demand for this fundamental rethink, the better, because we cannot let this dominant mindset that is, I think, still caught up in a sort of colonial worldview where the IMF, which is dominated by the G7 countries, where their policies and their mindset is framed by a post-Second World War settlement that even predates the independence of most parts of Africa. The fundamental balance of power is problematic. It's shaping how people see education finance around the world, and that has to shift. And the way to shift it is to stop talking about aid and loans and things that are going to further in-debt countries. Focus on tax justice and how you expand tax justice in order to achieve education justice. And I'll leave it there and pass back over to Hector and then on to, I think, Maria next.
Thanks a lot, David. This was a very good introduction, so really thanks. Now we're moving forward with Maria, who will also complement this information. So Maria, the floor is yours. It's also good if you just give a quick short introduction of yourself, Maria. Also, just a reminder to all the participants to keep your microphone muted, please, because we're not using the webinar layout. So it's important to always stay muted. Maria.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much, Hector. And thank you very much to the Global Student Forum for giving us the opportunity to present here with you and to talk about something that isn't the most sexy, isn't the most exciting thing. When we talk about tax, normally people don't get like, woo, this is the solution to the world's problems. But actually, there is a lot to do that we can do with tax, particularly tax justice, as you have heard, David, my colleague. So I am the coordinator for the Tax and Education Alliance, which is an alliance that brings together ActionAid, a global campaign for education, Education International, Tax Justice Network and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, with Tax Justice Network Africa and the Asia Pacific Movement for Debt and Development. So busy, but really exciting. I'm going to try to share my screen. And hope it works because I'm using an old computer and sometimes it doesn't work, but just bear with me, please. 1 second. Can you see it, Hector? Yeah? I take that as a yes.
Yes.
So, thank you. So, money isn't everything, that's for sure, but it does help, definitely, especially when we are talking about education. I'm going to give you just a few figures. So, there are 220 million students in tertiary education around the world. It has doubled since 2000, so it's only going to go up, right? In 2000, it was 100 million. That was the figure. Only in Latin America, the number of students in tertiary education has doubled in the last decade. And in Brazil, it has trebled since 2000. It's estimated that by 2025, 75% of the students will be coming from non-OECD countries, so from the non-rich countries, right? From low and middle income countries. And what we keep seeing is that because the governments are not investing enough in giving public and free education, particularly at tertiary level at universities, we are seeing this mushrooming of private universities. They are appearing everywhere, right? Many of them for profit, and many of them is just like a way of just basically just making money and just churning as many students as you can in order to make money and for the students to get some titles and in a way to be ripped off. And these students end up with massive, massive debt that they will be unable to pay, right? Which in the end is the government paying as well. So taxpayers, right, are paying for these massive debts from these private for-profit universities that are not actually providing good education, and everyone is losing as a result. So this is like the worst investment ever. And as David said, is the most regressive way of financing education. And education is not a commodity. Education is not a privilege. Education, it is a right. And this is really strong. Again, when we talk about rights and human rights, very often like people just like roll their eyes. It's like, well, if, you know, it could be a right, but if it is violated, it's still a right. Or it's the word right and human right has a lot more power and a lot more potential than people think. And to say that you have a right to education is to have that entitlement to free public education of good quality that needs to be available, accessible, adaptable, and acceptable, right? It has a lot more power, especially because all countries have ratified the Convention of the Rights of the Child, for instance. Also, well, with the exception of the US, big exception, I guess. And also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and they're obliged to use their maximum available resources. And this is not only the money that they have at the moment, as David was saying, in terms of the tax to GDP, but also the money that should be collecting, right? Because they are giving away massive amounts of money, for instance, in tax incentives that you can see here in this little cartoon, right? So they say, we don't have enough money, but it's because they are also giving it away. And it's not the countries that are giving it away. And we also know that corruption plays a big role in many countries, but it's also because, as David was pointing out before, because of the design of the international financial architecture, which is massively biased towards rich countries to benefit from the extraction levels, right? From low and middle income countries. So just to say that the student, the figure, the estimation for the student debt that keeps increasing, the student loan market is valued to be $4,000 billion. And it's again, they estimate that this figure is going to double by 2031. So where is the money? Where should the money come from? As I said before, and David has pointed out that as well, the money shouldn't be coming from families. It's the most regressive way of doing it, and it excludes big portions of the population, particularly those that are poor, has a massive gender implications, people with disabilities. Like normally, the people who tend to be prioritized is the firstborn male, right, in many cultures. And we see this particularly in higher education. So it produces inequalities intergroup, but also within groups, okay? So in between families, like in different regions, and also within the family. So what's the situation right now in terms of the, well, what was the situation before? David was talking about this chronic underfunding of education, right? So even before COVID, we saw that the education budget in low-income countries, the average was 17%, when the minimum is supposed to be 20%, but this hides some huge inequalities in terms of the education spending in many of the countries. You can see this table here on the right, which for me looks yellow, orangey. You can see the average expenditure per student in low-income countries, which is $188. Compare that to in high-income countries, which is $8,130 per student, right? So you can see, and again, these are averages, because in so low-income countries would spend a lot less, maybe even like $30 or $40 in comparison to some of the low-income countries that might be prioritizing education and might be spending $300. But what's also very interesting is to see the percentage of the school cost, not only the education financing that is borne by the government. So in low-income countries, it's 59%, whereas in high-income countries, it's 82%. So that leaves the households to bear a massive burden of the cost. And these are the poorest families, right? So in low-income countries, the average is 29% of the education financing is actually coming from the families themselves. Donors play only, again, 12%, and this is for low-income countries. And as David was saying, 97% of the education financing is actually coming from domestic resources, right, from the state. And only 3% is coming from aid, from international aid and assistance and donors. But they are actually shaping all the education policies. And again, they are breaking, right, that social contract of I pay taxes and the government is accountable to us, to their citizens, right? If you include the donors, like the government starts becoming accountable to the donors, right, to their citizens. So you can see how they break that social contract. And also the donors provide education as philanthropy, right, as charity. It doesn't become a right anymore. When it is privatized, it doesn't become a right anymore. You are paying for it, so it becomes a commodity. And this has huge implications in the sense of who attends education, what kind of what education is for, etc. So I'm not going to go into that just yet. So David also mentioned about the public sector wage bill caps that the International Monetary Fund keeps imposing in order not to hire the teachers that are retiring. And we have a massive teacher gap, like shortage of teachers, which has been estimated for many years now to be 69 million, which is going to be a lot higher. And the teacher task force is going to come up with a new estimate at the end of the year. So we look forward to that. That's coming from UNESCO. So we need to really increase the domestic resource mobilization, and we need to do it through progressive tax reform, right? David already mentioned about the debt servicing that is eating a huge part of the national budget. And this is having obviously implication of how much governments can spend on public services, particularly education. And of course, the cost is being absorbed by the families themselves, leading to privatization, cost sharing, which is leading to exclusion and social stratification. But if things were bad before COVID, things are only getting worse. We have seen that 2/3 of the low-income countries and low and middle-income countries have cut their education budgets. We have seen that government revenues as a whole have been falling. So if the average was 17% dedicated to education, right? because the whole size of the government budget has decreased. That 17%, it gets you a lot less than it used to do. We saw that health and safety nets were prioritized during COVID times, rightly so, but it has had consequences in terms of the education spending. And this has resulted in an increased levels of debt and poverty at national level and also at family levels, right? We have seen that the levels of poverty have really increased, debt have increased. And now what we see since the invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, the inflation overall, or the cost of prices, etc., is that poverty is actually increasing. And thus, actually impacting in terms of the opportunity cost, who can go to university these days, right? So this is a time when we need extra resources. Not only education needs to be free, completely free at all levels, but we also need to pay for people for the opportunity cost that it is to go to university and to go to the different levels of education. So in terms of who goes to higher education, who benefits most from the education financing, we see that when governments don't give adequate financing for education, it actually leads to a more regressive way of actually enjoying the education expenditure. So what we see here is that the poorest miss out on the public spending because they don't stay in school long enough. So we know that the education spending is higher at the at tertiary level than it is at early childhood and development and primary education, because the teachers and the facilities, they cost more, right? When the higher you go in education. But obviously, in terms of who goes to education, you have everyone having to go to primary education in order to then go to secondary education, and then it starts decreasing, and then who goes to tertiary education, right? So when you don't invest enough, we see that the people who go all the way through are those in the richest quintiles. And this is what this is showing. But as you can see, these, like the richest people in low-income country, make 42% of the students in tertiary education, right? Which in high-income countries, it is more equal. It's still not equal by any chance, but you can see that there is less disparities in this sense. And this has to do because of who can afford the fees, right? To go all the way through in terms of privatization, in terms of the opportunity cost, but also the way that education is designed to only privilege the elite in this sense, many low and middle income countries. Also, this has a gender effect, and we see that young women and girls also get less at higher levels. This has to do also with patriarchal norms because they serve to exclude them, but also the cost of education is the biggest barrier. It is compounded by the different intersectional oppressions. But this is, I think, is very interesting in terms of who starts like dropping out and who gets the most. So in terms of the using a per pupil funding formula, boys benefit more from each dollar spent as girls drop out. As you can see, when you put $1 in primary education, seems to be fairly equal. But then at secondary education, each child would get $1.4 for the boys, getting 30% more than the girls. And at tertiary, each girl gets $2.5 for every dollar, right? So they get 3 times more than the girls because the girls have already dropped out by that time. So I really recommend an intersectional analysis when we are talking about education budgets. So how are we going to increase the budgets for education financing? And David has already mentioned this. So we need to increase the share, and this is something that the education communities have been talking about for a really long time, about the importance of just like increasing the share of the national budget that goes to education. And it's 20%, but we know that even if it is 20%, in many cases, it isn't enough. So what do? We cannot keep increasing forever. So we need to increase the size of the pie, right? David has also mentioned it. And how do we do that? So the best way to do that is by increasing the tax to GDP ratio. And we need to do this through progressive tax reform. So we see that the average, again, of the tax to GDP was 17%. I think I saw it before. And in some cases, it's a lot higher than in others, even in low-income countries. Remember that there are some, these are averages, so there are some huge disparities within these countries. And what we see is that unless they have at least 20%, they cannot do enough to have any like decent network of like good public services, making them available, accessible, adaptable, and acceptable, right? But it's not only about increasing the share and the size, although the size is the most important one. That's why we are talking about taxes and progressive taxation, but also about how you allocate the education budget. And this has to do with the sensitivity. This is what I was talking about before, making sure that it is gender responsive or gender transformative, making sure that the poorest households get to enjoy make the most of the education spending, and it's not only favoring the elite or the richest quintiles. And then you also need to increase the scrutiny, because we need to make sure that the money that is being spent is properly budgeted, is actually arriving where it should do. And for that, it's not only a matter of tax experts, it's not only a matter of people working at the different levels of government, from national to provincial or local government, but everyone needs to be aware. And people need to understand how the budget works, where the money comes from, what taxes are used for, and this is what we are trying to do today as well. So, as I said before, for us, the most important thing is how to increase the size, because we have been talking about the share for a really long while, and we also, as I said, think that it is very important to increase the scrutiny and the sensitivity of the budget. But how do we increase the size? And my colleague Aurea from GATCH will be talking more about it. So these are only just some pointers. We need to increase the tax to GDP, particularly in low-income countries. The average is 14% versus the recommended 20% or higher. Illicit financial flows, so this is tax avoidance and evasion. So all the global tax abuse, right? All the money that is actually being sent illegally. In Africa, is estimated to be $88.6 billion every year, right? And $40 billion is supposed to be coming from the extractive industries, so all the mining, etc., right? But it is in Africa. $245 billion are dodged every year by multinational corporations, just using different like tax havens, different ways of not paying taxes as they should in each of the countries. The G20 countries, what are the richest countries, are losing $32 billion just from 5 technological companies. This was a study that we did a couple of years ago in ActionAid. So Alphabet, which is the parent of Google, Amazon, probably you are quite familiar with this one, Apple, again, probably quite familiar, Facebook, and Microsoft. So just by not paying the taxes that they should do, this is how much they are losing per year, just the G20 countries. So we need tax justice, right? Tax justice is where those that have more money pay more as a percentage than those that have less money and wealth, right? So we need tax justice to increase revenue, because tax pays for public services such as education, health, water, sanitation, roads, etc. We need it to increase redistribution. You must have seen the latest Oxfam report that they launched in Davos, how the inequality keeps increasing massively, right? We are just seeing at both ends of the spectrum, how the poor people are getting much, much poorer, and that 1%, all those billionaires keep getting richer and richer. And the pandemic and the war is just actually making that even like increasing that, right, exponentially. So tax justice ensures the redistribution, the transfer of wealth from the rich to the poor through pro-poor interventions as well, in terms of collecting the money, but also in terms of the expenditure. It also allows the repricing, using tax as a tool to encourage or discourage consumption of a specific good and services. you know that normally alcohol, but also sugar can be taxed more, luxury vehicles, but you can also use it for polluting, right? Polluting industries. You tax them more to make them go more to more environmentally friendly, right? And this is perhaps one of the most important things that people tend to forget is about increasing representation. This is about the social contract. When I was talking about when you pay taxes, you expect public services in exchange, rather than having to go to the market, being privatized, or having to rely on donors or philanthropy to get your rights, right? So it doesn't become a charity or commodity. So it is about this social contract between citizens and the states with rights and accountability. So just as a whole, tax justice increases sustainability, democratic accountability, governance, transparency, participation, institutional quality, and human rights. So what's not to like, really? So I will just finish with this in terms of some of the specific reforms that countries can take. And I'm sure that Aurea will be talking more about it. But we have seen that one of the most important ways of actually increasing the revenue and redistribution, etc., is by reviewing, stop signing, and consider canceling double tax agreements, right? Particularly with certain countries that are more like tax havens, such as Mauritius, but also the Netherlands. Don't think of tax havens always like being small islands in the Caribbean. The UK and all its networks is one of the massive global, like, enablers of global tax abuse. Also, to review, cancel, and stop giving tax incentives, especially to the extractives, so mining, etc. As we saw, that's where a massive avenue for just like losing tax revenue. Not to spend more than 12% of the budget on debt repayment services. That's something that I think that David has covered very well. Not to increase the value-added taxes, or sales taxes, which tends to be the first mechanism to increase revenue, right? All the time after the pandemic, you will have seen normally VAT goes up, and this is the most regressive, one of the most regressive forms of taxes, because everyone who buys those products have to pay the same amount of money, right? So normally indirect taxes such as VAT or sales taxes are more regressive than direct taxation, such as personal income tax or corporate income tax that has certain threshold, and the more you earn, the more you pay, right? So not to accept public sector wage bills constraints, again, like being able to spend enough money on teachers, on professors at the university, nurses, doctors, is necessary. This is the best way to actually increase the social and economic development of a country, right? Privatizing services has never helped. And as I said before, it's about increasing the 4 S's of the education budget. And I will remind you, which are the share, the size, the sensitivity, and the scrutiny, to demand debt cancellation and increase SDR allocation. What's quite but some of the UN tax bodies, you might have seen that just last year, towards the end of last year, the UN passed a resolution to work more on tax, and it's now about like getting a UN tax convention and a tax body to adopt and demand a minimum corporation income tax of 25%. At the moment, it's looking like 15%. And to tax wealth and the digital economy, and to demand transparency, accountability, and compliance using the ABC. And probably Aurea will be talking more about that. And if not, I can talk that in the question and answers. So thank you very much for your attention.
So much, Maria. As David's presentations, yours was also super interesting. So thanks for that. And now we're moving forward. We have with us also Aurea Mousinho, who is online with us. So same procedure. The floor is yours, Aurea, and if you can introduce yourself to the audience, that will be very nice.
Thank you, Hector. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Aurea Mousinho. I work with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. I'll talk a little bit more about what GACE is about in my presentation, but to say for now that GACE is also a member of the Tax Ed Alliance, and it's really a pleasure for us to speak with this forum, because having been a student and an active student in the student movement, and as a person that really believes that education is the pillar of many of the ideas that we have for a better world, it's always important to connect our struggles. Coming after David and Maria, it makes my life really easy, because then I can have the privilege of answering the question of more of how, particularly at GACE, do we go about fighting for these important things that they've outlined, what are perspectives, and on the why we fight in that way. So I'm making my presentation in two levels. One, where I'll be talking about and revisiting some of the issues that David and Maria talks about, the global infrastructure for how tax is organized at the global level. And secondly, I'll wrap up talking about at a level that I think is much more related to the struggles of the Global Student Forum on the connection between tax justice and gender justice, particularly with the work of our Tax and Gender Working Group. So on the first pillar about global economic reform and fighting for tax justice at the global level, as David and Maria had mentioned, we know by this stage what are the challenges that countries are facing and why tax justice and why fighting for progressive taxation is important to secure not only public service, but a decent life and more equal societies. But in then setting the task and asking ourselves, how do we go about it? Of course, there are challenges that pertain to how the global power dynamics are organized. As you know, global South countries in the global arena don't have the same voices, don't have the same, I wouldn't say rights, but don't have the same attention that many of the richer countries have, and don't have the same power to influence global norms in their favor. And this really puts them at a very hard situation, because a lot of our countries in Africa and Latin America and Caribbean and Asia are the ones that suffer the most with the regressive aspects of tax injustice on a global level. So GACE emerges out of an effort to ensure that global South countries, their voices, their issues, and their concerns can have a legitimate space and consideration when international tax rules are being defined. We are a Southern-led coalition, to say that we are not only formed of coalitions that are in the global South. We also comprise tax justice networks in North America and Canada and Europe. But the interest of GACE is really to bring together advocates through their regional network. So we work very closely, and our members are in the Global South, Tax Justice Network Africa, TGNA, Red Justicia Fiscal América Latina y el Caribe, and also TAFCHA, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, together with the other three I had mentioned. So the objective of GACE is to come together to ensure that through an understanding, a complexified understanding of what are the challenges for countries to actually increase the policy space for them to make this, to implement these tax reforms, then together fight for a fairer international framework, particularly in decision-making and application as far as international tax rules go. And there's, that's the overarching aim, in a way ideological, in a way diplomatic, but practically what we fight for through that, and at a very incipient level, is that the international arena, as far as tax justice is concerned, or tax rules are concerned, is more democratic and more inclusive and actually more representative. For many years, and up until recently, and Maria has mentioned about the progress towards a UN tax convention, international tax rules have been defined largely by the OECD, the organization the OECD, and the Organization of Economic Developed States. The challenge with that is that the OECD, one, is not an inclusive platform, that countries in the global south don't have an equal seat at the table, and critically, they don't have the same level of participation, and their views are not accounted in the same way as actual OECD members. As you know, if you're not on the table, you're probably on the menu. The rules that have defined international taxation and how it's governed up to now have really favored the interests of developed countries at the expense or at the detriment of global South countries. So the fight in the diplomatic level has been to secure the field to ensure that particularly countries in Africa and Latin America and in Asia, and not only just those countries, but particularly least developed countries in these regions, because we know particularly Latin America and Asia, there's a lot of inequality, and you actually have countries in those regions that are members of the OECD. But the least developed countries in the global south also have the space to implement or to have reforms that allow them to have the policy and political and fiscal space necessary to make those reforms in tax and tax policy feasible. David was talking about the role of the IMF. The IMF as an international financial institution, of course, is critical because they have a mandate to oversee issues around fiscal stability around the world and be a lender of last resort to countries in financial distress. So there are many layers in which the struggle connects between ensuring that there's a space for discussion, but also ensuring that advice that countries receive through international financial institution is coherent. One of the things that you will hear a lot from tax justice advocates and broadly economic justice advocates is pushing for policy coherence, to say that if, for example, you can't say that education is important if you're not making the changes at the international and structural level that will actually ensure that countries are able to invest in education. With the SDGs and countries, for example, signing up and having an agreement that they need to meet those goals, we also see this incoherence because there wasn't talk, for example, of the hindrances for countries to actually be able to increase both their share of investment in public services like education and in programs that reduce gender inequality, for example, but also increase their ability to raise those domestic revenues. So fighting for a fair international tax governance framework is actually a way to ensure that countries at the very least don't have an excuse to say I didn't do it because I couldn't, because now the struggle is at various levels. We have not only, let's say, a lack of political will, which is not a problem just in the global south, it's across the world. We see that across the world, countries are becoming, tax systems are becoming increasingly regressive because austerity and fiscal consolidation is a reality for at least 183 countries, as of the last estimates. But these effects are particularly detrimental for poorer countries because they don't have alternative forms of raising finance. And because of that, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice has stood very strongly in defending that international tax rules need to be defined in an equitable platform. Not perfect, but equitable, where every country can at least represent their interests, and the procedures for negotiation and achieving outcomes are clear. The United Nations is one such platform that it exists, where member states have equal footing. The procedures for negotiation are very clear. It's imperfect, we know, particularly now with the issues around corporate capture of the United Nations and many institutions, but at least it's a space that is worth fighting for, because because all countries can come to the table on equal footing. And I've said that before. And that's the reason that the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, we stand behind, and we've made it our mission to mobilize and work together with allies in the movement to work to advocate for a UN tax convention. We understand that a UN tax convention is a minimum requirement for us to start taking seriously the commitments that are needed to be made in terms of raising domestic finance, in terms of ensuring that countries meet their not only their financial, but also their human rights obligations vis-a-vis their obligations, for example, to raise resources to meet them. So that's on the global arena and the relevance of that debate. The key words really here are ensure that countries have policy space, ensure that the international rules are decided in a democratic, inclusive, and representative manner that take into consideration the interests, voices, and challenges of developing countries, particularly, but also that we have processes of negotiation and decisions that reflect true consensus, not in a way what happens in platforms like the OECD, where the idea of consensus is very flexible. You know, countries there can be consensus where countries object, which is what happened, for example, when Nigeria and Kenya objected to signing a deal that would effectively make a value of 15% as the global minimum tax rate, being 15% way below what, for example, many African countries already institute in terms of corporate taxation. So countries would actually be losing tax rights if they went with such a deal. But let me move forward to the second point of how we fight for tax justice at GACE. And this really is where my work is aligned. At GACE, I coordinate and lead our work on tax and genders through our tax and gender working group. And the ethos of the tax and gender working group is understanding that we can't just advocate for these reforms without making them pertinent to everyday issues. And at the time that the tax and gender working group was created, and therefore the GACE strategy on this issue was developed, there was really a gap in connecting and understanding how this macro level economic justice agendas connect to very important and everyday struggles of marginalized groups and women in specific. So in the tax and gender working group, we are a coalition. We are a coalition within a coalition of advocates, activists, organizations that work on women's rights, economic justice, that seek to come together to shape an agenda, an advocacy agenda, to influence the decisions around feminist tax justice. I won't have a lot of time to go into what feminist tax justice is, but I'll put some links in the chat because we have developed a guide calling Framing Feminist Taxation in 2 volumes that you can read. But essentially, feminist tax justice says that tax policies, tax system need at the very least to work in ways that are not disadvantaging women, but ideally promoting progressively promoting a gender transformative and gender just possibility. Sorry, someone was knocking my door. Okay, and gender just possibilities for women and all peoples in countries and in the world. So our work in the tax and gender working group has been really to look at how taxation connects with women's everyday lives. And one of the critical mechanisms and critical points of entry in the discussion has been the idea of public services. As I'm sure all of you know, public services are real equalizers in our society. because then the mechanism through which states can redistribute resources from the richer to the poor and create the basic conditions for egalitarian living in our societies. Tax-funded public services are then more sustainable because they're more sustainable and more accountable, because then you have the mechanism through which citizens can demand from the state or from their governments that investment, because they understand that they contribute for the making of them. So in the Tax and Gender Working Group, a critical point of advocacy has been to ensuring that tax resources are distributed in ways that promote the building up or reinforcement of gender transformative public services, by which we mean public services that help redistribute the care burden the care burden that women disproportionately carry all across our societies. But there's other elements, of course. Even though we've made progresses over the years, many tax systems around the world are steeped in implicit bias against women. And Maria earlier was talking about consumption taxes and VAT. Okay, I'll wrap up, thank you. Consumption taxes and VAT, and one of the elements of these, and being one of the most predominant tax tools that are used now, is that consumption taxes tend to fall heavily on women, because statistically women tend to consume a higher share of their income compared to men at the same income level. Of course, we have across income dynamics that both Maria and David have talked about. But this is to say that a critical point of our work in the Tax and Gender Working Group is advocating around the banner of making taxes work for women. And we are going to have this year, the 7th edition of our Make Tax Work for Women campaign, focusing this year on wealth taxation. And the idea is, because there are many layers of inequality in wealth that also map into gender inequalities, it is critical to have a strong front of feminist and women's rights advocates standing in support of taxing the rich, because taxing the rich is not only a way of improving our tax systems, but also a way of improving the democracy and the representativeness of our democracies, and strengthening also the social contract. I'll stop here and drop a lot of links in the chat, but thanking you in advance for having me here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Aurea, and David has also been sharing some links. So as a follow-up to this first meeting, we're going to share Maria's presentation and all the different links for all of the participants to be able to read, and also for those that were not part of today's session to be able to join the second session in case they can do that then. Today's idea was to give everyone kind of the basis for the discussions that will happen in the second session. So in the second session, we really expect participants to take, you will have a more active role, and we expect more participation, but we're still opening right now in these last minutes for any questions or comments that you might have. So if you have a question or a comment, please just use the raise hand function, and then I'll give you the word. So that we had one initial question from Abigail, who asked what is being done to balance tax justice, and how do you balance it in a country where taxes aren't paid correctly, specifically mentioning Liberia in this case. I don't know if anyone, David.
Look, I'm happy to say something. Liberia, I think, has quite a low tax revenue. And as I understand it, some of the biggest multinational companies in Liberia, including, for example, Firestone, which have got huge rubber plantations occupying a vast area of the country, have negotiated tax holidays, and they're effectively not paying significant amounts of tax into the national economy. So one of the really disturbing things is the extent to which big multinational companies end up in a position where they win all the contracts, they have access to all these resources, win these tax holidays. So not only do they have a scale of operations that will always crush local businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, but where they also win the tax holidays and export their profits and end up not giving anything back to the economies from which they're extracting wealth. That has got to change. How can you finance the public services in your country if the people who are extracting the largest amount of profit are simply avoiding tax? And actually, also in the process, the big multinationals often crushing the local private sector, the small and medium-sized businesses, which in most cases have to pay taxes and can't export their profits into tax havens. So actually, it distorts the economy in so many ways when the wealthiest elite of companies and the wealthiest individuals are so aggressively and successfully avoiding tax. So I do think the answer is to go for the biggest companies. Now, that's part of, there are things that can be done at a national level, and the government can step up and put more pressure on those companies and refuse to give tax incentives and tax holidays. But it is also about linking that local and national action to international action to change the way in which those global rules are set, because the global rules facilitate the plunder of resources from many countries. They make it almost impossible to track and tax the biggest multinational companies. That has to change. I think it's a big priority for the company to grapple with the taxes on the biggest multinational companies. Having a new body starting to be in place to replace the OECD will be part of the solution. That will take some time, but I think national pressure can make a big difference, but it will not be. It's very difficult to win a successful national campaign on tax justice unless you come together with the people who are working on public services, who are working on education and health and other public services, and feminist movements and movements who are working on different issues, coming together to say this is something where we need to build a joint platform to put pressure on our Ministry of Finance to reject the influence of the IMF and to chart a different path and to take direct action to tax the wealthiest companies and individuals. That's how we're going to win it. But it's only if the youth and student movements can connect with the National Education Coalition, with the national tax justice platforms and others, I think you can help to play a really pivotal role in shifting the balance on some of these things in quite a lot of countries.
David, I see that we have a question from Christopher, and then we're going to go with Maxi. Maxi, I think, is going to have his question in Spanish, so then I'll just remember all the panelists to switch to the Spanish channel so you can hear the translation if you need it. Christopher.
All right. Thank you so much, Hector. My first question is to David, but I think he has done a kind of justice to the question with regards to how domestically we can actually tax the multinational companies, knowing that these companies have several times been dodging paying of taxes for us to use as nations or as a country to sponsor or fund our education system. But I think his final input tried to do a lot of justice to that. But since the focus of this meeting is much more on students, I want to take his view again with regards to how he thinks breast students movements can actually facilitate this cause to make sure that government bring on board these multinational companies to pay their taxes for funding of education. So my question is specific to not to students and not to really to other social movement. How does he think that the student movement or student in general can actually cause in code that chaos for multinational companies to pay their taxes? And then my second question to him also have to be with the austerity measure by IMF. And now, how do we structure ourselves to that extent that to reorient the mindset of IMF from their current position in regards to putting hold on public sector employment and the rest, to instead of expanding the tax economy. And with regard, the second leg of that question also have to be that how do the government expand the tax economy, especially looking at the situation that if you tax some of these poor countries, for instance, Ghana, which is my homeland country, the rich have been taxed. Don't we think that the more the rich have been taxed, they are going to suffer the burden, and at the end of the day, some of them might end up being poorer? So those are my questions to David. If he can do some justice to that, thank you.
Well, I'll have a first crack at a bit of that and see if anybody else wants to come in. But look, I do think student movements play an absolutely critical role, because I think in one way or another, this is about the future you inherit. And if the country is got chronically failing public services, students are affected in so many different ways by that. But the power of a creative campaigning by students really can tip the balance, especially in Africa, where you've got such a large majority of the population are young. So helping student union leaders connect with other youth-led organizations. I do believe that the breakthroughs will come by how you work with others and convening and connecting with other movements. So most countries, there is a national education coalition, and we really need really strong student voices right at the heart of those coalitions. And I think once with that sort of decolonization lens, it's about how you can mobilize to put pressure on your national government to stop accepting this nonsense from the IMF. This ideologically driven agenda from the IMF, exposing that it's ideology, and that any Minister of Finance that submits to that IMF policy steer is complicit. We cannot actually hold the IMF accountable. Ultimately, it's the most profoundly unaccountable institution on this planet, but we can challenge ministries of finance in every country to resist the dogma and the ideology that the IMF brings. Not always easy, because a lot of people who are in senior positions in the IMF, in ministries of finance in a lot of countries, used to work for the IMF, the World Bank, or have a career projection that says when they finished their job at the Ministry of Finance, they're going to get a job at the IMF or World Bank. That exposing these revolving doors, the fact that these people are playing to a sort of self-interest about their own career prospects, and sacrificing the good of their own citizens in order to pursue their own careers. Challenging that, we can hold national governments to account. It's about the strength of the citizens' movements. And if the youth and student movements are right at the core of that, then there's so much more energy to some of these movements. And it has to be, you will only achieve it by working in alliance with I think, wider platforms. I think you need to come together with others to have that level of power to hold your own national government to account. That is the problem about the lack of accountability of the IMF. I could go on and on about that, but we are challenging them. We're trying to expose the contradictions in their own agenda, the fact that everything is driven by ideology, not evidence. They always claim they're driven by evidence, but they've got almost no evidence at all to defend their positions around cutting public sector wage bills and cutting public spending. It's pure ideology, and the more we can expose that, the better.
Thank you. Did you have something to add, Maria? Yes.
Yeah, very quickly. I think that it is really important to make the links, that when people say there is not enough money for public services, there is not enough money to give free education, to provide a free health care of good quality, you say there is not enough money because you are giving it away, right? And as David said, there are these revolving doors, not only with the World Bank and the IMF, but with many of our politicians who have some shares in corporations and are just benefiting themselves. And this is why it's so important, tax justice in terms of the representation. So it's making the connection that when corporations are not paying taxes, your family is paying for public services, or people are getting excluded, right? People are dying because they are not being able to access hospitals, to access healthcare. Like women are dying when they are giving birth because they don't have enough care, because corporations are not paying their taxes. And people need to understand that. And I think that is just so powerful. Once you have it like that and you expose it and people mobilize, for that, it's no longer a matter of corruption and it is endemic in our country and there is nothing we can do about it. Of course, we can do things about it, right? So we just really need to fight this type of most apoplexia of not being able to do anything because that's the way it is. It isn't. And when people say, oh, but if you start taxing corporations, then you don't have enough foreign direct investment and we really need to attract companies. Sorry, but it doesn't work. As David said, these companies who come with tax incentives, with tax holidays, they are not making your countries richer. They are just extracting the natural resources you have and they're making richer their investors, not your country, definitely not your country, okay? So again, expose this, right? Because that's not helping anyone. They are taking away the natural resources, and particularly Africa is really rich in natural resources, but not very rich in terms of the economic, this trickle down never worked. Like when people at the very top get richer, just like the trickle down economics doesn't work. Okay, but the IMF, the World Bank, and the people at the top of your government keep going on about the same economic ideology, and it just doesn't work. What works to sustainably grow a country's social and economic development is invested in free, good quality, universal public services, including education. Okay, so yeah, just spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And now we're going with, actually, before anyone switches interpretation channel, what we need to do is that Sebastian will help us to put the interpreter into the English channel. So those of you that speak English need to be in the English channel. And then you should hear that translation, because the next participation, I expect it to be in Spanish. Maxi Andrade from the Chilean Federation of Students. So let's give it a try, Sebastian, if you give us a thumbs up that you have switched the interpreter.
Yes, can you quickly try to speak? Hector?
Hello, sí.
English? Can you listen? Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay, great.
Go ahead, Maxi.
Good morning in Chile. Good morning in Chile. Well, my question has to do with politics. In what sense? How can we face those extremely right-wing type of discourses that are not in favor of rights of taxes? In Chile, they tend to say the taxes are theft, that politicians are stealing. So how can we make sure they can see that taxation benefits everyone? Because you may advocate for this, for tax justice, but here in Chile, we had president elections recently, and the president that won was in favor of minimizing the state. So this is populism-based. So how can we challenge this type of mindset? That is my question.
Just give you some seconds, Sebastian, so you switch back the interpreter. And then if you give us a thumbs up, Seb, we go forward with the answer. I see that David unmuted himself.
Good to go.
Perfect. Go ahead, David.
Well, look, I mean,
David, adelante. Una de las cosas que encontramos es, bueno, ¿cómo podemos recolectar más impuestos si vamos a terminar dando estos impuestos a un gobierno que es corrupto y no es confiable, no va a redistribuir los ingresos? Lo podemos ver en Canadá. Si las personas no tienen confianza en la manera en que el gobierno va a usar los recursos, pues va a estar renuente. Creo que por eso, cuando se fortalecen estos vínculos, cuando se hace de la mano, así es como se tienen que gastar estos ingresos, eso es crucial. Creo que con respecto a la corrupción, creo que las peores maneras de corrupción tienen que ver con el poder político, la influencia política, y en el momento el efecto es que la mayoría de los gobiernos son más responsables y, y se la pasan regulando el comportamiento de los ciudadanos, y lo que queremos ver es que haya gobiernos que sean responsables con sus ciudadanos y que regulen la...
Tax is at the heart of that. It's at the point at which you can start saying that these big corporations don't win these dodgy tax holidays for which they often pay big sums of money under the table. These tax incentives and aggressive tax avoidance is the deepest form of corruption that we face, and challenging and exposing that can be transformative. Now, I'm quite excited by the potential of the government in Chile having, Gabriel Boric as a former student union leader who challenged the extent to which privatization of education deepened inequality. There have been some challenges, I think, in Chile with the constitutional, the new constitution. But I think we can. There's a source of hope in quite a few of the Latin American countries. Obviously now with Lula in Brazil, with Petro in Colombia, with some progressive actors in quite a few of the Latin American countries, which I think have taken tax as one of the ways in which they can see a redistributive agenda being delivered in practice, the link between tax and public services. And we hope that we can build a solidarity now between some of those Latin American movements and the African governments who have started to call out the global community for its dodgy behavior on tax, because Africa loses over $50 billion a year in illicit financial flows, and the African Union ministers have stood up to the international community. So solidarity between Latin America and Africa on tax affairs could lead to a radical reframing and new possibilities in the coming years.
Thanks a lot. Maria, final words before we wrap up.
Oh, final words. Okay, I wanted to say something super quickly in Spanish, if that's okay.
Go ahead, and
Maxi,
Sebastian, just make sure to do the change, please, for the English speakers.
Maxi, lo que tú dices es súper importante.
Maxi, what you're saying is super important because we can see this now in the times of disinformation, lack of information. There are so many interests to say that taxes are something negative, along with corruption, but there's so much evidence. Privatization is truly making corruption increase. It has to do with the vicious and virtuous cycles. The education of society, you have better public services, people pay for their taxes. That is what we see in Scandinavian countries. Corruption drops. The lower the taxes, the lower the capacity the government has providing public services, corruption increases. So depending on us, depending on students, depending on everyone, it's up to us to expose this and not become accomplices with the system. But that's only benefiting great corporations.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for giving us this opportunity, and I really look forward to the next two sessions as well to discuss more with you, because I think that you have some great ideas and I would really like to hear them. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. David, did you have some final words?
Well, I
Very
just
brief.
wonder whether Abigail wanted to ask a quick question, but I do think, in the next webinar, we're going to be talking in different language groups, but also with practical case studies from different countries about how these tax justice movements linked to public services have started to make a difference. So hopefully there'll be some inspiring specific examples from your regions, which you can then connect with. And we need to make sure there's more time for dialogue and discussion then.
Definitely. So thanks a lot. We started 5 minutes late, so we're actually just 2 minutes over time. But next week, like David mentioned, we're having parallel groups, so we'll be in breakout rooms, everyone speaking their language and having more open discussions and discussing cases. So I really encourage all of you to join back next weekend. If you know someone else that had signed up and didn't join this week, remind them that this doesn't end today. And we're also going to send the documents and the presentation information for you if you have time to read before next session and to have more better discussions then. So thanks a lot. We had between above 50 participants most of the time, so I think this was very useful, and we really hope to see everyone next week. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.